if you go back into we actually started ranching in '73, and we identified the fact that we wanted to plant grass, but that was our goal. And we soon found out later that that wasn't necessarily what our goal should be. And so we, in typical fashion, I mean, we were going through the '70s and then into the '80s, which were real trying times, and a lot of people in agriculture were being forced out of business completely, out of the cattle business for sure. And so it was all about money with 20% interest and things like that. So as I mentioned, our goal was to plant some farm ground back to grass. So we did it price-wise, right? So you could buy crested wheatgrass for $2.50 a pound, or big blue stem for 14. So you know what we planted. It was crested wheatgrass. And this was back in the days when, real prehistoric, there was not such a thing as a grassland coalition or a grassland initiative or grazing schools or any of this. We had NRCS and some good people there. We went back to the days when we had the Great Plains contract as a means to sign up for any cost share. And so we were in survival mode and not necessarily doing things right. And the thing I want to point out is all the information and people available, resources there's out there today that weren't available that time. Things like the grazing school, and a couple of the most important ones that really changed our operation around were going to holistic resource management conferences, ranching for profit. And I think the one thing I hope I leave all you with today, whether you're a producer or advisors through NGOs or other agencies, is to help people get lined out to really know what their goal is. And as I already mentioned, we planted crested wheatgrass. A few years later, after we decided we needed to work in tune with nature and change our operation or finish going broke, we actually sprayed that out and planted it back to warm season natives. And so I just can't emphasize enough the importance of knowing what your goal is for your operation. Just because that's what I did, don't make it right for your operation. But I think it is important to know what your goals are and how planting grass fits into that. And take advantage of all the resources that are out there this day and age. It's unbelievable what's available between mentors and different programs. And again, if you're thinking of planting grass this year, you're probably not ready. The average operation, I think you need to start way ahead of time and line things out like what your goal actually is, and possibly resources to help you with that.
Thanks, Jim. So the way we're gonna, I guess I forgot to say this. I'm gonna, I got a series of questions for each panelist, but I'm gonna hit them with probably 2 in a row, roughly, and just kind of let you get to know each one a little bit deeper dive, and then we'll move on to the next one, and we'll just kind of rotate this around. So Jim really covered something that I know is near dear to his heart. He's been with the Grassland Coalition since its inception, actually, and that testament to the resources that are out there today versus what was. But Jim, I'm gonna dial back the clock on you just a little bit. So let's talk about, let's give us some insight. So when you first made this decision, you set your goals. What about financing it? How did you finance, not only the transition on the land back to grass, but how did you finance your education in this arena? The schools, the ranching for profit, the holistic resource management, all that. Give us a little bit of how does that look at home in the finances of the ranch? How did you do it? With support, out of pocket, or
all the above. I mean, there was, and thank goodness for sponsors of things like this program here the last 2 days, and even things back that far where we didn't necessarily have to put our whole cost of covering it, but still being gone was a challenge. I think of the time Carol and I went to the Ranching for Profit school, and luckily it was in Pier, so we didn't have a long ways to go, which is 60 miles for us. But we were back in those days when we did everything the hard way, and we were going for maximum production and going broke and everything else we could do as long as we could get it done in 24 hours a day. And so we were getting up like at 5 o'clock in the morning and doing chores and go spend all day at Ranching for Profit, and coming back home and doing more chores and pretending we slept for a little bit and do it again. We did this at our expense, and most of the stuff we did back then, because there just wasn't the partnership support that there is today. Back in those days, and I think it was in the middle to late 80s, each one of us, it cost over $2,000. That's big bucks when you're going broke. But the cheapest thing we ever did, and really turned our operation around and led to other things like holistic management and the grazing school and a whole host of things that were being sponsored by a coalition at that time. And so we financed it ourselves. I mean, we were desperate. We got cost share through the government, like I mentioned, a Great Plains contract. That's much like EQIP is today. We got cost share like on that grass seeding, and cost share to reseed it, and cross fencing, and we've been very fortunate with agencies and groups over the years to have cost share. We wouldn't have been able to do it. That's all there was to it. So, but when it came to schools and stuff, we just saw the importance of it, and those things get a little addicting, just like I'm sure things do for folks here in the crowd. Once you get a feel for it being an advantage to go to some of these things, or then you want to go to the next one, and you start figuring out ways you can do it, and you start getting smarter and operate with nature instead of against, and instead of calving in March like we were doing at that time, we calve in May now, and those things all free up time, and the real gratifying thing was, lo and behold, it was more profitable, and so that's why we've survived those times. And I'm going to throw a comment out here and suggest get ready, because history repeats itself, and I think we're going to see some real trying times in agriculture shortly.
Thanks, Jim. All right, we're going to move on to Brett next. Couple of questions for Brett. If you don't know Brett, and I've never met Brett, him and his family have been very transparent over the last several years about their story of converting their cropland back to grassland. And it's a fascinating story, a fascinating approach. I've always just been so intrigued by Brett's story. But we don't have time for Brett to tell his entire story because it is fascinating. So it's out there, it's on some videos, there's parts and pieces, and if you've not ever had a chance to hear the whole thing, it's worth it. However, today, we are going to address some of those questions, but Brett, before we do that, could you just remind everyone why you decided to pursue perennial cover on cropland that you both owned, and a big part of your story is pursuing perennial cover on cropland that you leased? So can you kind of remind everybody of why that made sense, what those goals were to take that risk on both owned and leased land?
Yeah, thank you, Pete. So, yeah, I think you're asking me to focus on the lease land thing, why we did it together.
Well, I don't think you can separate it very well, but you can do your best,
So, I have to go back just a little bit, and I'll talk fast because I know you can listen fast. So, we found ourselves in a crisis. So, change usually is driven by a crisis of some sort. And ours was financial, ours was lifestyle, so we knew we needed to make a change. And so we pulled a team together, people together. So the relationships that we built was the most important thing that had to do with our change. So the relationships that we built, we were able to pull together a team of people to help us figure out where we needed to go. And so once we did that, we set goals that we wanted to accomplish. And so some of those goals were, start signing the backs of checks instead of the fronts, quit spending big money, all that goes with that. And so to do that, we had to change a lot of things, and we had to change our whole system, if you will. And so we decided we wanted to plant everything back to grass and go from farming to ranching completely. And so we had to decide what we were going to do with our lease land, and I think that's where you wanted me to go with it. So in order for us to accomplish what we wanted to, and part of that was to getting rid of our line items rather than just chipping away at them a little bit. And so that was to get away from our fertilizer, get away from chemical, get away from insurance, get away from all those things that we're spending all our money on. So we couldn't just plant our own land back to grass and continue to farm our leased land. So because we wanted to finance it with the sale of machinery, and we had a plan that we put together that way. So it was an easy sell to our landlords because we proposed that we were gonna plant everything back to grass. We would continue to pay them the same rate, Cropland rate, and we would continue to increase their rental rate every year. And so we're gonna build their soil up. We're gonna do good things with their land, put life back in their land, and put their land actually in a more valuable place than it was when it was cropland. So they can understand that. So the reason we did that was because we wanted to sell all the machinery step by step by step to finance grass planting, to finance fences, water lines, and stuff. And we did have some help with some of it, with some important people that are in this room. We're thankful for that. Yeah, you know who you are. But the majority of it got financed through the sale of machinery, and part of our goals was along the line was to pay off our short-term debt, to pay off our immediate debt, and then our long-term debt, which we didn't do by choice. But we didn't know whether we could accomplish that, but we started into it, and we did accomplish all those things. We wanted to do it in 3 years, but it took us 6 years to do it. But so we didn't realize once we started into it how it was going to exponentially move us forward. Everything that we quit doing, which was every piece of equipment that we sold, we quit. Well, we took the money and bought things with it, but we quit putting fuel in it, we quit insuring it, we quit putting people in them. We eliminated them. But we had to do it strategically so that when we were through with them, we sold them and financed the transition. So that's why we had to convince our landlords that we would do it with their land, because we couldn't keep this stuff. So we had to do it. It was an all or nothing deal. So
I appreciate that. So I'm gonna ask you, this is a little bit of a modified thing. Brett, are you ready for this? So, we had a challenge yesterday from Matt Morlock to think about our programs and think about cooperative nature things. So Brett, specifically, in your transition back to grass with leased land, so I want to keep chipping away at some things with programs and try to help everyone understand where are we nimble enough, where are we not. So in your case, there's no right or wrong answer to this, but could you or would you or did you even desire to use a, say, federal, state, or conservation funding or anything like that on that leased land when you're working with, say, multiple landlords that you've got a relationship with? Were any of those programs nimble enough for you to even consider? I mean, I know you financed it with the machinery. That was probably the quickest, easiest way to get to your goal. But in your opinion, would that have even worked for you to maybe try to use conservation funding in the transition of that leased land back to grass? Or I don't know if we've ever talked about that.
Yeah, we didn't. We did use some help on some acreage that we own. With the leased land, we paid for 100% of the transition ourselves.
Okay.
And I guess we didn't want to involve our landlords, directly in the process. So, I mean, maybe they would have been involved, but
it would have been challenging, I would imagine.
Yeah, it would have been challenging, probably. There's probably some programs out there that would have allowed us to do that because, we didn't have a long-term lease, but we had a long enough term lease that maybe. maybe they could have, but there's other people who would be able to answer that question better. But we didn't do that with lease land.
Okay, appreciate that. And I'm gonna, of course, we're gonna come back to everybody as we roll around. So the next up are Dean, Candice, Lockner. I'm not as familiar with I actually didn't, that's why I was so intrigued to invite them on this panel, because Dean and I were talking at the Grassland Coalition meeting here back in December. I had no idea about that part of their story is their conversion story back to grass. So, your story too spans a couple of generations. And although you've been involved with conservation for many years, I don't think your restoration story is as well known as maybe some of the other panelists. I'm just not sure about that. So could you describe the scope and scale of your transition on your ranch from Cropland back to working grasslands? Kind of scope and scale of the timeline that you guys started your process?
Pete, did you say restoration or frustration? I
Both.
wasn't sure.
Both. Look to your left for frustration, look to me for restoration.
Well, when I came back to ranch, I was working with Candice's family, and I wasn't a manager, I was a worker on the ranch, but there were things that frustrated me, and I was seeing topsoil being lost, I was seeing saline areas popping up, and they were getting worse. And, you know, my motivation was if I ever became manager of this place, there were some of those things that had to change, and the way to change that was to putting them back to grass. Now, that wasn't going to happen until, you know, they always say change comes one funeral at a time, you know, and that's kind of what happened. Also, when I did become manager of it, I would have started changing sooner, but I knew some of the changes I made, the people that owned the land were going to say, well, I could do that, you know, just turn a bunch of cows out, and of course they had no concept of really what we were doing, and they really didn't care. And so once we gained control of the management, I started proceeding. For example, there's a gravel road that runs 4 miles from one end of the ranch to the other, and it's all uphill on one side and downhill on the other. And when you get a heavy rainfall event or a spring snow melt, that water would run over that road in 14 different places. And we were losing topsoil in the ditch, and I said, we can't keep doing this. So my original goal was to plant everything uphill back to grasslands to hold that soil. And we started in about the mid-90s doing that, and by 2007 we had all of our crop ground, which was about 1,500 acres at the time, planted back to grasslands. And since that time, water has not run over that road since we got everything planted back to grass, except maybe if a culvert was plugged from snow or something. But it's been a huge transition.
So, again, this is a little off script, but I want to just ask you one level deeper dive. So, all of you so far have cited goals that were, I would say, ecological goals, just doing the right thing for the land. You know, that's been the theme so far. So I'm going to ask you guys, did you put pen to paper or pencil to paper? You knew what you needed to do. You needed to go back to grass. You stated that as a goal. Did you actually plan that financially to ensure it was going to work, or was it just a leap of faith? How did you approach that with the family and with the
Well, it definitely was both. I mean, there was if it had not been for the assistance of NRCS and I mean, all you people in here have had something to do with helping us, I would have proceeded with what I wanted to do, but it would have been at a much slower pace because I couldn't have done it financially. Yeah, it would have been my goal either way, but it would have been much slower without all the help.
Okay, thank you, Dean. Thank you. Candice, you have anything to add before we pass it on down to Wilbur?
Well, without our NRCS assistance with fence lines, fences and water tanks and water pipes, how many, 7.5 miles of
7.5 miles of water line.
water line? You know, what good would pasture be? Because we have pasture with no water. So, you know, we needed fence, we needed water, we needed assistance. And thanks to people who are in this room, and especially our special friend and mentor, Jim. Because of NRCS and Grassland Coalition, they have transformed our lives in ways that I can't even begin to say thanks for.
Thank you. Why don't you go ahead and pass that down to Wilbur? When it goes, Don, don't cry, don't cry, don't cry. Okay. We have an ongoing joke with Don then. So, all these people I actually count as my truly dear friends. My newest dear friend in the group is Wilbur. I just, a kindred spirit, just a fantastic family and individual. So, it was a little bit of arm twisting getting him up. In fact, he said no until I said, well, I thought we were friends. And he said, all right, pull that card, right? Anyway. So Wilbur, over the last couple of years, you and your family have decided to pursue a transition from farmland, or from cropland farmland back to perennial cover at a scale and a rate that is, arguably very aggressive. And that's created unique opportunities and challenges. So in relation to that, your question's gonna be a little bit different. So in relation to federal, state, or NGO conservation funding and program support, what's been the most impactful thing? And impactful can mean positive or negative, but impactful so far. What's the biggest lesson you've learned in this thing in regard to leveraging or financing this project?
Thanks, Pete. Pete sent that question out 2 weeks ago, and I think my answer changes, every time I look at it. So there's been a lot of challenge. Little background, my wife Eric and I, we have 8 kids, and that's, so our story doesn't even begin in Montana, or in South Dakota. We're from Montana, so we're probably the newest residents of South Dakota today. So we had an operation that Eric and I were blessed to build 30-some years, and it ran well. We had a neat system, and we had adult kids that were wanting to come back to that. But I guess that's what led us to South Dakota too. There were some things in our area that, as we look forward, that maybe I'm the guy that's always trying to find an opportunity. And as I thought about the next generation, there was less opportunity in their future. So we took a big look around, and there was, and found an opportunity in South Dakota. So that's been a lot of challenge. How do we get to South Dakota? Well, honestly, it's a God thing, and as Brett and I talked this morning, that the first step, after you involve, God in your planning, is marry somebody smarter than you are. And Erica, stand up. You know what? I end up here, but. She is really the one that should be up here, because one of the things that
Erica, that's not my fault. Do not hold out against me.
I'm going to get around to the question, Pete, but one of the, we didn't start this, back to what Jim said about, you better be planning ahead. We had done a lot of this in Montana, and so the thought process, I came down here, and maybe that is one of the things that's probably much different than, when I came down here, I had it all lined up, and had a plan, and it was an aggressive plan, but knew what the approach needed to be. But I'm also smart enough to say, this isn't my country. We don't have a generational tie here to draw on and say, well, what's March typically look like? And what can we expect in May? So you ask a lot of questions, and that's the beauty of where we sit today is you're in a room full of people, a lot of them have done it. Most of the people up here probably have a lot more experience, doing some of the things that we're in the middle of doing now. So make those connections. It's, I think one of the things that is really neat about this deal is they include a phone number. So you find somebody, you meet somebody, you got their phone number in that book, call them. Time's too short for some of these conversations. It takes a deeper dive. But I will tell you that some of Jesse Lisberg was one of the guys that I met early on. And maybe the beauty of how our relationship started was we got to know each other. My family and I, we spent the place we bought was under lease. There was a year left on the lease, which we honored. So we had the opportunity to come down that first year and fence. And so I was down here full time. My crew would leave Montana in the dark Monday morning and get here at noon, and they'd work half a day on Thursday, go home and take care of things in Montana the weekend. And so we've spent a couple of years, a lot of time on the road, a lot of time apart from family. And so this transition thing has been, it's not without its challenges, but in that first year, I guess, as we're fencing, I would have time, to make some of these relationships, and I think that's kind of a key thing. You better find the right people, and you better be like-minded. You and I and Jim were talking last night, and there is no recipe. The thing that worked for Jim or the thing that worked for Brett might not be the thing that works for me. But it's hard to figure some of that out unless you have these conversations. Jim said you better start with a goal, and that's kind of what we did. You couldn't just run away from something that wasn't a good fit in Montana. You had to have something to run towards. But one of the big things that was hard for us, still is we spent, Eric and I spent 30-some years in Montana forming relationships and building a reputation. We end up in South Dakota, and where we're at, we're just kind of outside of our circle of who we're used to dealing with, and so you don't get to bring the reputation, and that's kind of a hindrance too. Relationship, that's probably one of the key things to, and someplace in there, Pete always, I always remind Pete that I'm an economist first, not a native pasture purist. So some of that has changed in that, Jesse and I spent a lot of time together that summer. It helps you if you buy a piece of ground that's almost endless. A lot of people had some experience with it, and Jesse had a personal interest out there and looked at this thing for a long time. But one of the things that really changed our approach to what we wanted to do, because I had a plan, was time with people like Jesse, Cassie Ox, another one. So as you talk about NGOs or government involvement, I have some frustration with that. Typically, those organizations and those government agencies have a hard time responding at the pace I want to run. And, case in point, we came down spring Memorial Day weekend in '24, I drug an engine water engineer from Montana down that I worked with up there. And we shot all the elevations for the entire 44 miles of pipeline. And because we had Memorial Day weekend that worked. Well, it's not an easy thing to just say, okay, we got this. Is there any funding to help with any of this? Everybody's like, whoa, there's a process here. And, you know, so I think we didn't do that initially. It wouldn't have worked. There's been help provided, but a lot of that came after you had a relationship. And part of developing a relationship is, you know, it's kind of a marriage, and there things don't fit. So you better take the time, back to what Jim said, you better have this thought out, and you better ask some questions. And I'm getting leave here.
Well, no, so one follow-up question, we're gonna move on to Don, but I think, you know, what, you know, I appreciate you laying out kind of that, all that background. The question is though, if the dollars don't match the goal, do you chase the dollars? And I think you're saying very clearly that probably does not fit your business strategy to chase the dollars if they don't match the goals.
Yeah, I think that's a hard no. You know, the thing that I know about my deal is I want the autonomy to do a thing that worked for us for a long time in Montana. So if we couldn't work with somebody and maintain that autonomy and manage a thing a certain way, and I'm not going to tell you that we've got all that figured out, but there are organizations that are, and some of that money tied to something much more rigid. Yeah, that's a hard no. You know, this is largely self-funded. You know, there's certainly been help, but you know, and it's way past the dollars. It's the people. You know, everybody in my family has made some sacrifice to make this work. So that it goes way beyond the dollars. Yes. And this is way beyond just a snapshot of dollars that are involved in the project for a time. It's a relationship that I think over a longer period is important. And there are people that I can work with in that. We share common goals and value things similarly. So, yeah.
Appreciate it. It does. We're going to move on to Don now, which is almost polar opposite situation than you might say Wilbur's as far as scale, scope, and location. So Don, you and your family have recently begun restoring a fairly high-value cropland in, by Beersford. One might argue they're some of the richest farm country in South Dakota. So tell us about the decision to take that risk and take on paper, high value crop ground and going back into grass. So what drove that decision, Don?
I think I'll go back to a comment my grandpa made when he bought his farm was ground is high today and cheap tomorrow. And so I've always had that mentality that it's just worth the investment. Fast forward then to our 40s, we always just wanted to have cows. So with my husband being a cattle buyer, there's transient cows out of place all the time. And they're big and they're beautiful. They stay 30 days and then they're gone. So I think, we wanted our own that we could look at every day and care for. And then in the pursuit of finding grass, well, good luck. That just wasn't an option in our area. And if it was because it wasn't farmable because it was wet. And then at that point, we just said, then we will buy our own. And this is a God thing too. Maybe you're seeing a reoccurring theme up here of something bigger than us. A farm came up for sale 2 miles from us. And at that point, I just didn't want to know myself if we didn't get it. I became very invested in the place when the for sale sign went up. When the gavel hit and we got it, it's a pretty big deal. But I think in our heads, we kind of knew that maybe this 5-year thing, and that's maybe what little we did think about financials, was we're gonna do this for about 5 years, rent it out, put some money in the kitty, and then take this leap of faith and plant it. But prior to that too, my husband and I have been together 20 years. The first 10 years of us being together was pretty breakneck of him just working really hard. So we were able to plop some money down on it. But that day that we bought it, I had no idea. I just knew we wanted to run cows on it. I just didn't know how we were gonna get there. And so on the 4th year of renting it out, that's when I started doing my homework and said, I am not smart enough to figure this out on my own, even though I'm a farm kid. And then in the same time, a God thing again, a dear friend of mine, I ran cows with a gentleman, and he got leukemia, and he said, do you want to take this over? So now, I've just doubled my acres, which was like, wow, I gotta do this right. And I found a coalition.
You okay with one more question, or do you want to pass the mic?
Yeah, I'm good.
You're smiling.
I'm tough.
I win. I'm sorry. No,
I've had heifers threatening me all week. I'm tough.
You're talking about that. All right, so let's do a little bit of a. So Don, in your situation, okay, so you got we helped, you and partner do 80 acres or so this year in the grass. So just share with the crowd, how did you finance your transition back to grass in this first phase, and how important is cash flow, or what has the cash flow been in this transitional phase when you're not actually getting a return? You have a very stated goal of going back to grass and cattle, but so how do you finance it, and if you're willing to share, like, how important is that cash flow, or how are you bridging the gap of cash flow on those acres, if you're willing?
So I would go to say that they say Vegas has gamblers, but I would challenge them with the people in this room. I think we got a hell of a lot more gamblers in this room and in the Midwest. I would be lying if I said I knew. It was a gamble. It was a leap of faith to do this. And I've been with my husband 20 years. I got a playbook on him. So 3 years ago, I started mentally prepping him that he's not going to get his cash rent anymore, and we're going to have to go $0 on income. And I think that's where, in his head, because he's the banker, started, working harder, finding more orders. Financial-wise, when we bought the ground, it was, we knew that day when we bought it in 2019 that we couldn't do it then. We couldn't have zero income on that. And that's where looking at our business, we figured, well, 5 years, by 5 years, we should have enough money that we can go $0. But then I went to the Grasslands Coalition, and I learned about a program with Ducks Unlimited, and hats off to Kenna here, and Dan Nelson helped say, hey, we realize that we need to invest in this. We know that you're hanging up a cash rent of $300 an acre. This is, here's a program to help that. And then I felt like a real hero when I walked in the door. Like, look at this, and so that made a big difference.
Thanks, so I'm going to go to Brett next. Brett, this is a little bit of a stretch question, but you've got a pretty long history in the state. With past chairman of the Grasslands Coalition. I think your exposure. I think you can give us some insight on this. But recently, it some of the other panelists know this, I've been working, several of us have been working with a gentleman, down by the Smith area. So this is my lead up to this question, give you some perspective. Starting to get more and more questions about how do you build an operation. Let me back up a second. Ranching for Profit and some of our other schools would indicate that, maybe a person doesn't have to own all the land that they build their operation on. Maybe you can build a business, and so others have successfully built businesses on rented ground. But specifically, with your experience on rented ground, going back to grass, this question becomes pretty relevant. So in this case, this producer and his son want to take 3,000 or so acres in that Kingsbury County area and go back to grass. And some of that's leased land. So the question is, can that business model of restoring leased land to perennial cover work anywhere in the state, do you think, and I guess this is just your opinion, in that model? What advice would you give someone what do you consider when you're thinking about building an enterprise on leased land that actually includes perennial covers? So if that's a clear enough question, take it away. I guess I can add more, but I think you get where I'm going.
Yeah, so I think it's relative. So there's no reason that what would work on a piece of land in Jones County that has 2 or 3 inches of topsoil, or none at all, compared to land maybe back east that has more rainfall and a lot more topsoil. So, but your prices are higher. So that's what you're getting at really there, is that your lease price is a lot higher, but it should be relative, in my opinion, that you should be able to, it's gonna grow what it's gonna grow, just so you got a lot of growth productivity there. So whatever it is that you're gonna, so it comes back to a lot of other things that come before that. It comes back to what are your goals? I think everybody up here has kind of said that. What are your goals? Write them down, and that's gonna be your northbound compass. So it's always gonna go back to, does this decision that I make take me closer to my goals? So that's gonna drive what you do. So therefore, it shouldn't be any different with that leased land than it would be owned land. The value's higher, but what am I gonna do with it? So you gotta figure that out first. What am I gonna do with it? What's my resources? What am I gonna take off of it? How am I gonna market it? So you gotta have a plan, and so go back just a little bit further. So the relationships have been talked about. You gotta build your relationships. You gotta get you gotta figure out your people. Who do I need to get on board with me? And you gotta have your people in place before you start any endeavor. Once you figure that out, and then you figure out how to get people on board with you, because you got to all go in the same direction. So to make anything work, you have to have that accomplished first. So I think the answer to what you questioned is yes, but you have to be strategic, you have to plan, and you have to figure out what your resource base is, what you're going to market, and so you got to figure that out.
So drill into this just a little bit deeper. So one of the things that in these conversations is risk. So in your opinion, Brett, mitigating those risks, you got the risk of course, of weather and drought on that. There's some risk. There's this risk of maybe cash flow in those first couple of years if you don't achieve establishment. And then you've got that reputational risk with your landowners. Are you actually, is this going to work? How did you mitigate some of that? Longer term leases on the front? I know you talked a lot about relationships, and that's pretty obvious, but what tidbits of advice might you have if, as you're stacking up those risks, to mitigate some of those more specifically? Because I think what the theme is maybe here is, if you're going to restore on leased land, you might be looking at a little bit more out of pocket than you are, maybe financial help from others. Just because of the complication of bringing in landlords. So what do you think? I mean, is it long-term leases? Is it?
Yeah, anytime you go into an endeavor like that, the longer your lease is, the more opportunity you have to to move forward and recover, but you also want to have an exit plan. You know, I think that has to be in place right away as well. So, you know, I wouldn't go into anything like that with a 1-year lease. Yeah, it wouldn't be very smart, probably. You know, unless your landlord was willing to be your financial partner, which they could be, possibly. But, you know, yeah, the 3, you know, our leases are minimum 3 years, you know, but we also promise escalating contract price, so that's why we can get a longer term lease. So then we have more opportunity to recover our investment going forward. But an exit plan would be obvious, that whatever you do there, you take as much back home with you as you can. I mean, that just would be obvious exit plan.
Okay. Appreciate this. There's a lot of young people asking these questions, which I'm excited about. So I think what is obvious, you know, I don't know that everything is obvious. You know, I mean, it's obvious because you've been through it, but I think that some of these things they're not as obvious out there in the landscape as they should be, some of these strategies. So I really appreciate you commenting on that. Let's pass it down to the Lockners. I'm going to ask the audience, do you guys have, is there burning questions out there? I mean, we can keep, I've got more scripted questions, but we got about 10 minutes left in our forum here. Is there any, raise your hand if you have a question. We'll see what kind of pressure we have out there for questions. Okay. Okay, everybody okay with me keeping? All right, so, Candice and Dean, knowing just a little bit about this, I think it's been pretty fascinating, some of what you've shared with me. So regarding your business decision to go back to grass, has it been a sound and profitable business decision for your ranch over time?
What really has changed us the most is when we went to the Ranching for Profit School. We were already headed down a path that we thought was the right path. But going to that school, and both Candy and I went, it convinced us that we weren't going fast enough. And from that point on, we went to the school in 2016. And basically what that school did for us is you take all your different enterprises that you have. You know, you might have a farming enterprise, a haying enterprise, a cow-calf enterprise, and you figure out which enterprises are making you money. And every business has what they call dead wood. There's enterprises that are just sucking money out of your total business. And we narrowed that down, and we kept narrowing it down. From the time we went to school in 2016, by 2020, we had decided to sell the last of our cows. We were out of our cow-calf operation, and we became a custom grazing operation. We are ranchers who own no cattle. We only own 20% of the land that we operate. And you always hear people say, well, you need to diversify. Well, most people in agriculture that diversify, well, then I'll buy some sheep, or they'll have all these enterprises, but they don't really know what enterprises are actually making money. Well, when we figured out that for us, the custom grazing thing was the best thing to do, all of a sudden we had all these assets, cows that we sold, we had machinery and equipment that we sold, and we had all these dollars. And it said, okay, well, now we got to pay taxes. Oh, that was terrible, you know. So, one of the things we learned in Ranching for Profit, Dave Pratt, who was a teacher at the time, he says, just pay the damn tax. So now that's one of my passwords on my. So once we got over that, okay, so we diversified, but it wasn't back into agriculture. We took those monies and we found financial advisors that we trusted and learned from, and it's just part of building community and talking to people that you can learn from and trust. And you know, I thought the stock market was a fool's game. I told myself that my whole life. And so those extra monies, we ended up investing into mutual funds. And just as an example of what that diversification did for us, we now, when we're filing our taxes, are not considered farmers anymore because we don't have 2/3 of our income from agriculture now. And so You know, there's so many ways to make money other than agriculture. Now, our agricultural side is profitable, but all of that stuff that we thought we had to have, it was dead weight.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Thanks for sharing that. That's actually really insightful. We're doing okay. Got one more question. I think I'm gonna give it to Jim, but Jim, let's do this in 1 minute, okay?
1 minute.
If you had to do it all over again, what would you do differently, if anything? From the time of that goal to going back into grass, looking back over your shoulder over the last several decades, what might be a tidbit or two that you might advise someone to do differently than you did?
Well, a couple things. Number one, and I already mentioned that a lot of these things weren't available, but if they would have been available sooner, that surely would have moved our process up considerably. And I think the value of searching out those people to network with, if I could have done that quicker, I think that would have had huge value. Because they're out there. I ended up hiring a consultant, a retired NRCS person, again at my own dollar, to come and evaluate our operation, and he's the one that really changed us around by advising us that we were putting way too much money into inputs, which you've been hearing as a common theme here. We were spending our year putting up hay in the summer and hauling it out in the winter. And when we switched that, and I want everybody to take this home with them, when we switched that process to making natural resources our priority versus pounds or whatever, again, I repeat, when you put natural resources as your priority, your profitability will go up right with it. And it totally amazed me how soon that happened in our operation. We went from being on the brink of being a past operation to profitable and paid our debt off at a pace that I couldn't believe. So those are some things that you almost have to live it to believe it, that it's that networking and resources you go to and opportunities to attend things like this, and the list goes on that I didn't mention over above the grazing school and ranching for profits come up different times, but you've been a lead on different things with fire schools and grass establishment and stuff, and those things all have huge value that would have been nice to have sooner, but they're there now. So.
Appreciate that.
And one more little thing, I mentioned that profitability that led us to, and I know one of your questions early on was the fact of what other enterprises that led to, well, when our natural resources squared away, and it was never in our business plan, but we added 200 enterprises into it that again increased our profitability.
Appreciate that. Yeah, I had something. I'm gonna go to Don. We got about 2 minutes left, so let's move.
Talking about the ranching side of it being profitable, it just, originally I had about 4,000 acres that I was managing. And we are now just down to 2,500 acres that we're managing. I'm grazing more animal units on 2,500 acres than I've ever grazed on 4,000 acres, just because of the improvement in grasses and using the short duration rotational grazing. So it shocks me how good it is.
Thanks for answering that question that I didn't even ask you yet, because that was your next question, is keeping it profitable over time, so appreciate that.
And even with all this expertise, we are now at a place where in our journey, as we continue to learn and grow and network and utilize resources, we actually are going to pay more taxes from our investment income than we will make from our farming. So I'm just saying the journey never ends. Our story continues to evolve, and you just need to link up with smart people, because you're only as smart as the people you hang with.
All right, we're gonna end that ask. So Don, 10 seconds. You're brand new, you're newbie on the block, but you're inspiring a lot of people. Would you do anything different over what you learned over the last year and a half, what would you change if you had to change one thing? Anything?
No.
No? Okay. All right, well, one thing I want to wrap this up, and Erica got her day in the sun, but Carol, Matt, Lori, everybody, Erica, you can, but let's give those spouses a round of applause.
Since you didn't have anything. One last thing I would add is that, because there's just, we hear about succession and things, so things really started to escalate when we got together with our family and we split the land and livestock, and my parents moved into an advisory mentor role. And everything got better for everybody when we made that move. And we made that move before we started this transition. So I mean, that was really an important thing. It took some strategy to get my dad on board with it all, but once he did, he said something that I think is worth remembering. He said, we should have done this years ago. And he meant it. So, and I always remind him, well, we did what we thought was right at the time, you know, but he's right. So don't wait. That's my point with that. He said, we should have did this years ago, and he's right, we should have, but we didn't. You start where you're at, and you head towards where you want to go.
Appreciate that very much, and I can't thank these people enough for the influence that they've had. You mentioned mentorship. It's amazing, the influence they've had on my life personally, what I've been able to bring back to my own small operation here in South Dakota, but also my family in Minnesota was going through some of those exact same things that Brett just mentioned, elderly parents and transitioning their land and all this, and that's why I invited them up there. They've been very influential, and so on behalf of myself and the entire room, let's give these folks another round of applause.